There is a rule in the North Atlantic that is almost never broken. When a human body hits water that is 28 degrees, the clock starts. The lungs gasp, the blood freezes, the heart stops. By every law of biology, life ends in minutes. It is a mathematical certainty. But on the night the Titanic fell, one man cheated the math, while millionaires froze in their tuxedos and the greatest machine ever built tore itself apart. A simple baker was treading water in the dark. He wasn't praying. He wasn't shivering. He was calm, he was warm, and he was undeniably drunk. How did a man fueled by whiskey outlive a disaster that claimed 1,500 souls? Was it a medical miracle or a mistake in the design of human biology? Tonight, we are going beyond the iceberg and the band playing on the deck. We are going to analyze the strange frozen hours where logic failed and alcohol became a shield against the abyss. So, dim the lights and settle in. We are about to uncover the dark, fascinating story of the man who toasted the end of the world and lived to tell the tale. The North Atlantic Ocean at 2 in the morning is not a place where human life is meant to exist. It is a void, a vast indifferent blackness where the water temperature hovers at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Salt water can stay liquid below the freezing point of fresh water, meaning the ocean is technically colder than ice. When a human body hits water this cold, the reaction is violent and immediate. It is called the cold shock response, the lung spasm, forcing an involuntary gasp. If your head is underwater when that gasp happens, you drown instantly. If you manage to keep your head above the surface, the blood vessels in your skin slam shut to preserve heat for the vital organs. The heart rate skyrockets. Hyperventilation sets in. Panic is not a choice, it is a physiological mandate. Within 5 minutes, fine motor skills are gone. You cannot tie a knot. You cannot hold a railing. Within 15 minutes, the body begins to shut down completely. Consciousness fades. The heart, battered by the cold and the shock, simply stops. This is the medical reality. It is a timeline written by biology and physics, and it is rarely wrong. But on a moonless night in April, amidst the debris of the largest moving object ever built by human hands, there is a man paddling in the black water. He is not gasping. He is not shivering. He is moving his legs with a slow, rhythmic determination. He is surrounded by the dying, by the chaotic noise of hundreds of people realizing that help is not coming. Yet he remains eerily calm. He checks his life belt. He keeps his head up. He looks at the stars, which are painfully bright in the clear, freezing air. He should be dead. By every medical chart and survival table known to science, his heart should have stopped beating 10 minutes ago. But he is not dead. He is warm. He feels a strange, insulated heat radiating from within him, a barrier against the Atlantic that defies explanation. He is a baker, a man who spends his life surrounded by the roar of ovens and the smell of rising dough. And right now, floating in the killing fields of the ocean, he is the only man who seems entirely at peace with the night. To understand why this man is alive when so many others are gone, we have to look away from the water. We have to go back to the light, to the heat, and to the massive, arrogant machine that brought him here. We have to understand the system that he served and the peculiar, specific choices he made that evening, choices that would look like vices to a moralist, but which turned out to be salvation in the freezing dark. Before the silence of the ocean, there was the noise of the bakery. Deep in the bowels of the ship, on D-deck, Charles Jogan presided over a kingdom of heat. He was the chief baker on the RMS Titanic, a title that carried more weight than one might expect. On a ship of this magnitude, feeding the population was not cooking. It was logistics. It was an industrial operation that required military precision. Johan commanded a staff of 13 bakers. They worked in shifts that never really ended, a perpetual cycle of kneading, proving, and baking that ran 24 hours a day. The ovens were massive, coal-fired beasts that radiated a heat so intense it could be felt through the steel bulkheads. While the passengers on the upper decks wrapped themselves in furs to ward off the April chill, Jochen and his men worked in undershirts, sweating in the heavy, yeast-scented air. They were responsible for 2,200 souls. Every morning, thousands of fresh rolls had to be ready for the breakfast tables in first, second, and third class. There were specific breads for the consommé, specialized pastries for the high tea, hearty loaves for the crew. The bakery was a factory of comfort. It was designed to create the illusion that the passengers were not floating on a fragile skin of steel in the middle of a hostile wilderness, but were instead seated in a hotel in London or New York. Joachim was a man of the system. He understood the rhythm of the ship. He knew that order was the only thing keeping the chaos of the ocean at bay. He was 33 years old, a native of Birkenhead, England, with the sturdy build and calm demeanor of a man who had spent his life at sea. He was not a romantic. He did not look at the ocean and see poetry. He saw a job. He saw a schedule that had to be met. The heat of the bakery was his constant companion. It soaked into his bones. It was a dry, dusty heat, filled with the particles of flour that danced in the electric lights. In the days leading up to the disaster, Joachim was a fixture in this warm underworld. He checked the stores. He inspected the bread. He managed the personalities of his crew. He was a cog in the machine, a vital part of the massive organism that was the Titanic. And like everyone else on board, he believed in the machine. He believed in the steel. The Titanic was not just a ship. It was a cathedral of the industrial age. It was the physical embodiment of the Edwardian belief that humanity had finally conquered nature. It was nearly 900 feet long, a mountain of iron and rivets that displaced 66,000 tons of water. When it sat in the dock at Southampton, it towered over the buildings of the port, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch for miles. The press called it unsinkable. It was a word that would haunt history, but at the time it wasn't seen as hubris. It was seen as a statement of fact. The ship was designed with 16 watertight compartments. The theory was sound. If the hull was breached, the water would be contained. The ship could float with 2 compartments flooded. It could float with 3. It could even float with the first 4 compartments completely full of water. The engineers had done the math. They had calculated the worst-case scenarios, a collision with another ship, a ramming of a dock, and they had built a vessel that could survive them all. But mathematics is only as good as the assumptions it is built upon, and the assumptions of the Titanic were flawed by arrogance. Because the ship was deemed practically unsinkable, the safety systems were treated as secondary. They were afterthoughts. Regulatory requirements for lifeboats were based on the tonnage of the ship, not the number of passengers. A rule written in a time when ships were a fraction of the Titanic's size. So, the Titanic sailed with 20 boats, only 20. If every single boat was filled to capacity, they could save 1,178 people. But there were over 2,200 people on board. It was a simple, brutal equation. If the ship went down, half the people were doomed before the voyage even began. But nobody looked at the math. They looked at the promenade decks. They looked at the grand staircase. They looked at the electric elevators and the swimming pool and the Turkish baths. The lifeboats were viewed as clutter. In the original designs, there were plans for more boats, rows of them that would have lined the upper decks. But the designers felt they would spoil the view. They would crowd the walking space for the first-class passengers. So they were removed. The view was preserved. The safety was discarded. Charles Joachim wasn't privy to these high-level decisions. He was a working man. His concern was the bread, not the boats. But he lived within the culture that these decisions created. It was a culture of absolute, unshakable confidence. Why worry about lifeboats when the ship itself is a lifeboat? Why drill for a disaster that cannot happen? This confidence filtered down from the bridge to the engine room, from the stewards to the bakers. It created a sense of routine that bordered on religious faith. The ship left Southampton, stopped in Cherbourg, then Queenstown, and then turned its bow west toward the open ocean. The engines fell into a deep rhythmic thrumming, a heartbeat that vibrated through the floorboards of the bakery. It was the sound of progress. It was the sound of safety. Joachim's life on board was governed by the clock. Discipline was the currency of the crew. His rank as chief baker gave him privileges, but it also gave him burdens. He was responsible for the behavior of his staff, for the quality of the product, for the efficiency of the department. To manage the stress, to manage the long hours and the intense heat, Joachim had his own rituals. He drank. It wasn't a secret, and in the context of the merchant marine, it wasn't particularly scandalous. Alcohol was a part of life at sea. It was a way to mark the end of a shift, a way to socialize, a way to sleep when the ship rolled in heavy seas. But for Jaugen it was steady. He wasn't a man who got sloppy or belligerent. He was a functional drinker. He treated whiskey with the same respect he treated his yeast. It was an ingredient. It was a tool. He kept a flask in his cabin. He would take a nip here, a nip there, never enough to impair his work, but enough to keep the edges soft, enough to keep the heat of the ovens from becoming unbearable. This relationship with alcohol is crucial to his story. In the moralizing that followed the disaster, some would point to his drinking as a sign of lax discipline, but biology would disagree. In the strange alchemy of that freezing night, the alcohol in his blood would play a role that no doctor could have predicted. As the days passed and the Titanic moved deeper into the Atlantic, the routine solidified. The bakers kneaded, the ovens roared, the passengers dined on the finest food ever served at sea. The ocean was calm, the weather was crisp. It was, by all accounts, a perfect crossing. Then came Sunday, April 14th. It was a day that felt ominous only in retrospect. At the time it was beautiful. The sun was bright, the air bitingly cold. As evening fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. The passengers retreated from the decks, seeking the warmth of the lounges and the libraries. Jaugen finished his shift and retired to his cabin. He had a bit of whiskey. He rested. Outside, the conditions were changing. The wind died down completely. The ocean became a sheet of glass. This is a rare phenomenon in the North Atlantic, to see the water so perfectly flat that it reflects the stars without distortion. It was hauntingly beautiful, but it was also deadly. To understand why, you have to understand how lookouts spot icebergs at night. They don't see the white of the ice, not at first. They see the breach of the water. When waves hit the base of an iceberg, they create a line of white foam, a phosphorescent ring that warns of the danger in the dark. But on this night there were no waves. There was no foam. The icebergs were silent, black shapes drifting in a black sea, invisible until they were terrifyingly close. The ship was steaming at 22 knots, nearly full speed. The captain had received ice warnings from other ships, messages that clicked over the wireless telegraph, warning of a massive ice field ahead. But the culture of the time dictated that you didn't slow down until you saw the danger. You trusted your eyes. You trusted the lookouts high in the crow's nest, but the lookouts were blind. They had no binoculars, misplaced in a locker back in Southampton, and they had no breaking water to guide them. They were staring into a void, their eyes straining against the freezing wind, tears streaming down their faces from the cold. They were looking for a shadow in the dark. In the bakery, the ovens were cooling down for the night, though the heat still lingered. The night shift was preparing the dough for the morning rolls. Jaugen was off duty, perhaps lying in his bunk, feeling the vibration of the engines, the steady pulse that told him everything was right with the world. At 11:40 p.m., the world changed. High above, in the crow's nest, the lookout Frederick Fleet saw something, a shape, a blackness that blotted out the stars on the horizon. It was directly ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times, clang, clang, clang. The sound was sharp and lonely in the freezing air. He picked up the telephone to the bridge. Iceberg right ahead. On the bridge, the officers reacted instantly. Engines were thrown into reverse. The wheel was spun hard over. The massive ship, weighing tens of thousands of tons, began to turn. But momentum is a cruel law. A ship of that size does not turn like a car. It slides, it drifts. For 37 seconds, the crew held their breath. The bow swung slowly, agonizingly to the left. It looked like they might make it. It looked like the ice would pass harmlessly down the starboard side. But the iceberg was not just a wall. It was a jagged weapon. As the ship glided past, an underwater spur of ice, hard as rock, scraped along the steel plates of the hull. It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a thundering impact that threw people from their beds. Down in the dining saloons, silverware rattled gently on the tables. In the cabins, it felt like the ship had rolled over 1,000 marbles. It was a vibration, a shudder, a long grinding jar that lasted for 7 seconds. In his cabin, Charles Jaugen felt the jar. It was distinct enough to make him sit up. He knew the rhythm of the ship, and this was an interruption of that rhythm. But it didn't feel catastrophic. It felt like a mechanical hiccup. A dropped propeller blade, perhaps, or a wave hitting at an odd angle. He didn't panic. He didn't rush to the deck, he waited. But deep below the waterline, the reality was already horrific. The ice had not sliced the ship open. It had buckled the plates, it had popped the rivets. Thin slits had opened up along 300 feet of the hull. Water was jetting in with the force of a fire hose. The mailroom was flooding. The firemen's quarters were flooding. The cargo hold was flooding. And then the math took over. The watertight compartments, the safeguards that made the ship unsinkable, were filling one by one. The first compartment, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. The designers had said the ship could float with 4 compartments flooded, but the ice had opened 5. From the moment of impact, the Titanic was a dead ship. It was a mathematical certainty. It had 2 hours and 40 minutes to live. But nobody knew that yet. Not the passengers sipping their nightcaps, not the band playing in the lounge, and certainly not the baker sitting in his cabin, wondering why the engines had stopped. The silence that followed the impact was the most terrifying sound of all. The heartbeat of the ship, the vibration that had been constant since Southampton, was gone. The lights still burned. The heat still radiated from the radiators, but the life of the machine had been extinguished. Jochen stood up. He smoothed his tunic. He checked his flask. He didn't know it yet, but the grand ambition was over. The era of confidence had ended in 37 seconds. Now the era of survival was beginning. He stepped out of his cabin and into the corridor. The ship was steady. The floor was level, but there was a strange energy in the air. Stewards were moving quickly, whispering. Doors were opening. He made his way up toward the boat deck, not out of fear, but out of duty. If there was trouble, the bakers would be needed. Food would be needed. He was a man of the system, and until the system completely collapsed, he would play his part. He emerged onto the deck. The air was shocking, cold, still, and utterly silent. There was no wind. The steam was venting from the funnels with a deafening roar, a stark contrast to the quiet of the sea. He looked around. There was no panic yet, just confusion. People were standing in clusters, breath fogging in the lights. Some were laughing, making jokes about ice in their whiskey. They were standing on the deck of a ship that was already dying, but the illusion of safety was so strong, so perfectly constructed, that they couldn't see the truth. Jochen saw the officers gathering. He saw the crew beginning to uncover the lifeboats. And for the first time he felt a prickle of something that wasn't quite fear, but a deep, instinctual unease. He looked at the boats. He looked at the crowd. He did the math in his head, the same math the designers had ignored. There weren't enough. He turned back toward the stairs. If the ship was in trouble, his men needed orders. If they were going into the boats, they would need bread. The instinct to feed, to provide, to organize overrode the instinct to flee. He went back down into the warmth, back to the bakery, back to the whiskey. He didn't know that he was walking away from the only exits. He didn't know that he was about to embark on a journey that would take him to the very bottom of the ocean and back. The water was rising in the bow. The angle of the deck was beginning to change, imperceptibly at first, then with undeniable gravity. The grand ambition was sinking. The reality was rushing in. And Charles Jochen, the baker who drank whiskey, was about to face the test of his life. The smell of fresh bread is usually the smell of life. It is the scent of morning, of safety, of a house that is warm and ordered. But at 12:30 in the morning on April 15th, the smell of baking bread became the smell of emergency. Down on D-deck, Charles Jochen had gathered his staff. The order had come down from the chief officer: provision the lifeboats. It was a command that tried to impose logic on a situation that was rapidly spiraling into insanity. The ship was sinking, the Atlantic was waiting, and the bureaucracy of the White Star Line was concerned with whether the survivors would have a snack for the journey. Jochen did not question the order. He was a creature of habit, and in the absence of a new reality, he clung to the old one. He mustered his army of 13 bakers. They were frightened men. They could feel the deck beneath their feet assuming a strange, subtle angle. They could hear the distant, muffled sounds of shouting from the decks above. But they looked to their chief, and their chief was calm. They raided the pantry. They brought out 40 pounds of bread, huge crusty loaves that had been baked for a Monday morning breakfast that would never be served. Jochen organized a bucket line. They carried the loaves up the stairs, navigating the labyrinth of the ship's service corridors. It was hard, physical labor. The bread was heavy, the stairs were steep, and with every step upward, the reality of the night became harder to ignore. When they reached the boat deck, the cold hit them again. It was a slap to the face. The steam was still roaring from the funnels, a deafening white noise that made conversation impossible. Jockin directed his men to the boats. They tossed the loaves in, 4 loaves to a boat. It was a pathetic gesture in the face of the freezing ocean, a carbohydrate offering to the gods of the sea. Most of the boats were still covered. The crew was struggling with the davits, the complex pulley systems designed to lower the boats to the water. The ropes were stiff with cold. The paint was new and sticky. Nothing worked as smoothly as it had in the harbour at Southampton. Jockin watched the bread land on the floorboards of the lifeboats. He knew with a sinking certainty that bread was not what these people would need. They would need heat, they would need rescue. But he had done his job. He had followed the order. He sent his staff back down below, telling them to wait, to be ready. He didn't tell them that there was nowhere left to go. While Jockin was moving bread, the ship was dying by degrees. The mathematics of the sinking were proceeding with a ruthless mechanical efficiency. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was on the bridge. He held the blueprints in his hands, his face pale. He had done a quick tour of the lower decks, and he had seen the water. It was green, it was rising. It was swirling around the spiral staircases of the crew quarters. The mailroom was already gone. The mail clerks drowning as they tried to save the sacks of letters. The squash court was underwater. Andrews did the calculation again, hoping for a mistake. But the numbers were absolute. The Titanic was designed as a balance. The weight of the steel was balanced by the buoyancy of the air inside the hull. But the air was being replaced by water at a rate of tons per second. The balance was broken. The bow was getting heavier. It was pulling the ship down by the nose. This created a pivot point. As the bow went down, the stern had to rise. It was a lever, 900 feet long. At first, the rise was imperceptible. A glass of water on a dinner table might show a slight slant. A door might swing shut on its own. But soon the angle would become undeniable. The deck would become a hill, then a cliff. Andrews looked at the captain. He gave him the timeline. An hour, maybe 2. It was a death sentence delivered in a whisper. Back in his cabin, Charles Jockin was preparing himself. He had finished the bread detail. He was technically off duty again, though the concept of duty was dissolving. He retreated to the sanctuary of his room on E-deck. The water hadn't reached here yet, but the tilt was noticeable now. He had to lean slightly to stand up straight. He reached for the bottle. It was whiskey. Standard issue. He poured a tumbler half full. He didn't sip it. He drank it. This is the moment where the legend of the drunken baker begins, but to dismiss it as drunkenness is to misunderstand the physiology of survival. Jockin wasn't looking to party. He wasn't looking to forget. He was medicating. The alcohol hit his bloodstream. It dulled the sharp edge of the panic that was clawing at the back of his mind. It slowed his heart rate. It dilated his blood vessels, creating a flush of artificial warmth. In a normal situation, this dilation is dangerous in cold weather. It brings blood to the surface where it cools down faster. But Jockin wasn't in the water yet. He was in a stressed, cooling ship. The whiskey made him feel invincible. It made him feel steady. He poured another. He drank that too. When he emerged from his cabin the second time, he was a different man. The rigid adherence to protocol was gone, replaced by a loose, functional confidence. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace. He wasn't staggering. He was navigating. He went up to the promenade deck. It was now around 1:20 a.m. The atmosphere had shifted. The joking was over. The band was playing. Yes, that part of the myth is true. They stood in their overcoats playing ragtime tunes, a surreal soundtrack to a nightmare. But the faces of the passengers were tight with fear. The women and children were being loaded. The rule of the sea, women and children first. It sounded noble, a code of chivalry, but in practice, it was messy. It was heartbreaking. Families were being torn apart at the gunwale. Husbands were stepping back, kissing their wives, handing over their children, and stepping into the shadows to die. Jockin saw the hesitation. He saw women clinging to the rails, refusing to get into the small wooden boats that swung precariously over the black drop. The drop was 60 feet down to the water. It looked like suicide. The ship still felt solid, warm, safe. The boats looked like toys. Juffin didn't have time for hesitation. He saw lifeboat number 10 being loaded. It wasn't full. None of them were full. The crew was afraid the davits would buckle under the weight of a fully loaded boat, another lie told by the architecture. The boats were tested for full capacity, but the crew didn't trust them. Juffin stepped in. He grabbed a woman who was hanging back. He didn't ask her, he didn't comfort her. He picked her up, his baker's forearms hard from kneading dough, and he tossed her into the boat. He grabbed another and another. He was rough, he was efficient. He was the machine working when the human element faltered. Some of the women screamed. They thought he was a brute. They smelled the whiskey on his breath and thought he was a madman. But he was saving their lives. He was forcing them to choose survival when their minds were paralyzed by fear. He didn't try to get in. At one point he skipped down to the pantry again to get a drink of water, plain water this time, and then came back up. He saw a boat lowering and realized it was undermanned. There were no sailors in it to row. He could have jumped. He could have claimed a seat as a crewman needed to command the vessel. He didn't. He looked at the boat, looked at the water, and stepped back. He waved it down. He stayed on the ship. Why? Perhaps it was the whiskey making him feel safe. Perhaps it was a deep, subconscious understanding that the boats were a lottery he had already lost. Or perhaps it was simply that he hadn't finished his job. By 1:40 a.m., the class divide on the ship had become a physical barrier. The gates that separated the third class in the steerage from the upper decks were locked. This wasn't malice initially. It was American immigration law. The steerage passengers were considered potential carriers of disease. They had to be processed separately. The gates were there to keep them contained. But now the gates were death traps. Down in the labyrinth, families were screaming in languages the stewards didn't understand. Polish, Arabic, Italian, Irish. They were banging on the steel grates. The stewards, terrified and lacking orders, kept them locked. They were waiting for permission that would never come. Jochen was on the upper deck, the domain of the first class. He saw the Astors, the Guggenheims, the men in tuxedos lighting cigarettes, standing calmly because their code of honor demanded they die with dignity. But Juggin wasn't a gentleman. He was a worker. He didn't care about dignity. He cared about utility. He realized the ship was listing heavily to port. The deck was no longer flat. It was a slope. Walking required effort. You had to brace yourself against the bulkheads. The lights were still on, but they seemed dimmer, redder, as the generators struggled to power the dying Leviathan. He went down to his cabin one last time. It was a dangerous trip. The water was rising fast now. When he reached E-deck, he saw the water creeping down the hallway. It was black, oily, and silent. It wasn't rushing anymore. It was simply rising, like a bath filling up. He saw the ship's surgeon, Dr. O'Loughlin. The doctor was standing in the corridor looking at the water. They knew each other, two men of the ship's senior staff. "Hello, Juggin," the doctor said. The casualness of the greeting was absurd. Juggin nodded. "Doctor, it's finished, isn't it?" "It looks that way." The doctor looked at Juggin. He saw the calmness in the baker's eyes. He didn't scold him for the drinking. In fact, there is a suggestion that he might have encouraged it. "Drink up, Jochina," he might have said. "It's as good a way to go as any." Juggin went into his room. The floor was wet. He found his flask. He didn't gulp it this time. He put it in his pocket. He adjusted his clothes. He put on his heavy baker's coat. Then the water touched his shoes. It was time to leave. He climbed the stairs for the final time. The angle was severe now. The stairs were difficult to climb. He had to haul himself up by the banisters. He passed people who were just sitting on the steps, weeping or staring blankly at the wall. They had given up. The exertion of fighting gravity was too much. When he emerged onto the boat deck, the boats were gone. All of them. The davits stood empty, like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky. The last boat, Collapsible D, had just pulled away. There were 1,500 people left on the ship. The silence of the early evening was gone. Now there was a low, rising roar. It was the sound of voices, prayers, curses, goodbyes. It was the sound of a city realizing it is about to be destroyed. Jafin walked to the promenade. He felt useless. The bread was gone, the boats were gone, the order was gone, but his body still wanted to work. He saw deck chairs, hundreds of them, lined up for the morning sun that would never come. He grabbed a chair, he threw it overboard, he grabbed another and another. He worked with a manic intensity. He threw 50, maybe 60 chairs into the black water below. In his mind, it was a strategy. If people are in the water, he thought, they will need something to float on. I am building rafts. It was a futile gesture. A deck chair in freezing water is not a life raft. It is a clumsy piece of wood that offers little buoyancy. But it was an act of defiance. He was refusing to just stand there and die. He was throwing the furniture of the civilized world into the maw of the ocean. As he worked, the ship groaned. It was a sound deep in the keel, a tearing of metal that vibrated through the soles of his feet. The bow was so heavy now that the propellers were lifting out of the water. The massive bronze blades, the size of windmills, rose into the air, dripping and silent. The stern began to rise. Jafin stopped throwing chairs. He couldn't stand without holding on. The deck was aslide, people were losing their footing. He saw a group of passengers lose their grip and slide down the deck, tumbling like rag dolls until they hit the railings or vanished into the flooded well deck. He needed to get higher. He needed to get to the stern. He began to move aft. He didn't run. He couldn't run. He climbed. He climbed over railings. He pulled himself along the walls of the deck houses. He was moving away from the water, retreating to the last piece of dry land left in the world. He passed the gymnasium. He passed the smoking room. He saw men inside, sitting at tables staring at their brandy. They had chosen to stay inside the machine rather than face the chaos outside. Jafin kept moving. He was dismissed from his post. The bakery was underwater. His staff was scattered or dead. The captain was likely dead. The organization of the White Star Line had ceased to exist. There was only the man, the whiskey in his blood, and the freezing Atlantic waiting to claim its prize. He reached the rail at the very stern of the ship. He climbed over it. He stood on the outside of the railing, holding on with one hand. He looked down. The water was hundreds of feet away, but it was coming closer. The ship was pivoting. The stern was rising higher and higher, aiming for the stars. Jafin took a breath. He adjusted his coat. He checked his flask one last time, then tossed it away. He didn't need it anymore. The waiting was over. He was standing on the edge of the world, and the world was tilting him into the abyss. But strangely, he wasn't afraid. The alcohol hummed in his veins. The cold air felt refreshing. He watched the lights of the ship flicker, once, twice. Then they went out. The darkness was total. The only light came from the stars, and in that darkness, the ship began its final plunge. When the lights died, the Titanic ceased to be a ship. It became a falling mountain of steel. The darkness that swallowed the vessel was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that erased the separation between the sea and the sky. For the 1,500 people left on board, the loss of power was the final psychological blow. The electric light had been their tether to the modern world, a promise that technology still held some dominion over nature. When the filaments faded to orange and then to black, that promise was broken. Charles Joughin was clinging to the rail on the starboard side of the poop deck. He was now positioned on the outer shell of the ship. As the stern rose, he had climbed over the safety railing so that he was standing on the side of the hull, holding the rail as if he were hanging from a cliff edge. But the cliff was moving. In the darkness, the sounds became the only reality. A terrible, groaning roar rose from the center of the ship, the sound of boilers breaking loose and crashing through bulkheads, the sound of machinery tearing itself apart as gravity twisted the keel. Some survivors would later say the ship broke in two. Joughin, riding the very end of the tail, felt a violent shudder, a sickening drop, and then a strange, momentary leveling. The stern settled back, just for a moment, as if the ocean were hesitating. Then the final angle took hold. The stern section, now detached or hanging by a thread of steel from the flooded bow, began to rise vertically. It went up and up, until Joughin was no longer standing on a ship, but hanging from a tower that pointed straight at the zenith of the sky. He was 150 feet in the air. Below him was a churning cauldron of people, wreckage, and suction. Above him were the indifferent stars. Most men in this position screamed, they panicked, they lost their grip and fell, cartwheeling into the propellers or smashing against the floating debris. Joachim did not scream. He checked his position. He shifted his weight. He was riding the stern like an elevator. As the ship began its final slide beneath the surface, Joachim didn't jump. Jumping was a mistake. Jumping meant hitting the water with force, risking injury, risking the shock of sudden immersion. Instead, he waited. He rode the hull down. He watched the water rising to meet him, not a rushing wave, but a smooth, rising tide. The speed of the sinking slowed at the very end. The ship, acting like a piston in a cylinder, was cushioned by the air trapped inside the stern. It slid into the Atlantic with a terrifying, majestic grace. When the water reached Joachim's feet, he simply let go of the rail. He didn't make a splash. He didn't go under. The suction that dragged so many others down, the hydrodynamic wake of a 60,000-ton object displacement, didn't touch him. He stepped off the Titanic as if he was stepping off a bus. His head didn't even go underwater. He was wearing a lifebelt, his heavy baker's coat and his trousers. The only thing he lost was his hat. He was alone in the black water. The noise that followed was the sound of humanity dying. It was a wall of sound, a collective cry from hundreds of people struggling in the freezing dark. It was a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. A sound that one officer described as a heavy murmur like the droning of bees in a hive, only amplified to a nightmare volume. But Joachim paddled away from it. He was a strong swimmer, and his instinct was to put distance between himself and the desperation of the drowning mass. He moved his arms in a slow, breaststroke rhythm. The water was 28 degrees. At this temperature, the cold is not a sensation. It is an assault. It feels like fire. It penetrates the skin instantly, stabbing at the nerve endings. For the average person, the pain causes immediate hyperventilation. They inhale water, they panic. Their muscles lock up within minutes. Joachim felt the cold, certainly, but he didn't feel the terror. The whiskey he had consumed, that steady, rhythmic dosing over the last 2 hours, was now performing a physiological miracle. Alcohol is a vasodilator. It opens the blood vessels near the skin. In survival training, this is usually taught as a death sentence. It flushes warm blood from the core to the surface, accelerating hypothermia. A drunk man in the snow freezes faster than a sober one. But the Titanic disaster was a game of minutes, not hours. For most people, the shock killed them before the hypothermia did. The terror stopped their hearts, or the gasping filled their lungs. Joachim's alcohol-soaked system was insulated against the shock. He remained calm. His blood stayed warm just long enough to get him through the initial trauma of entry. He didn't gasp. He didn't flail. He just swam. He swam for what felt like 10 minutes, moving through the debris field. He saw deck chairs, crates, and bodies. He pushed them aside. He was looking for a boat. He was looking for anything solid. The screaming began to fade. This is the darkest part of the story. The silence didn't come because people were rescued. It came because they were gone. The cold silenced the voices one by one. The heavy murmur thinned out until the ocean was quiet again, save for the lapping of water against cork lifebelts. Joachim was still paddling. He was treading water in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, suspended over 2 miles of depth, with no land for 1,000 miles. He saw a shape in the darkness. It was low in the water, a dark hump. He swam toward it. It was Collapsible B, one of the canvas-sided emergency boats. It had been washed off the deck upside down. It was floating hull up, a slippery turtle shell in the swells. There were men standing on it, balancing precariously on the curved keel. It was a fight for purchase. Every time the ocean swelled, the boat rocked, and the men had to shift their weight to keep from sliding off into the freeze. Joachim swam up to the side. He reached out a hand. "Push off," someone shouted. "We're full. There's no room." It was Officer Lightoller. The man was clinging to authority, even as he clung to a piece of wreckage. And he was right. The boat was already dipping dangerously low. One more body, One more 150 pounds would flip it or sink it, drowning them all. Juffin didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply said, "All right." He found a spot near the stern of the overturned boat. He couldn't climb up, so he hung on. He hooked his arm through a piece of rigging, letting his body float in the freezing water while his head and shoulders stayed above. And there he stayed. For most men, this would be the end. Partial immersion in freezing water is lethal. The legs numb, the blood cools, the heart gives out. But Jogan hung there. He treaded water slowly, keeping his legs moving. He looked at the men on the boat. He recognized Isaac Maynard, a cook from the kitchen. "Hello, Isaac," Jogan said. Maynard looked down, teeth chattering, face grey with cold. He reached out a hand and held onto Jogan's wrist. It was a small anchor, a human connection. Jochen floated. He looked at the stars. The sky was brilliant. Without the light pollution of the ship, the Milky Way was a slashed scar of diamond dust across the blackness. The air was perfectly still. The sea was perfectly flat. It was a peaceful scene, horrific in its tranquility. Time lost its meaning. Was it an hour? 2 hours. The whiskey began to wear off, replaced by a dull, creeping numbness, but the panic never came. Jochen existed in a state of suspended animation, a metabolic truce between the alcohol, his body fat, and his sheer stubborn refusal to die. He noticed the water around him was getting clearer. The black was turning to charcoal, then to a deep, bruising indigo. Dawn was coming. The light revealed a graveyard. The ocean was littered with white shapes, the life belts of the dead. They bobbed gently in the swell, a field of buoys marking the site of the tragedy. But the light also revealed something else. To the east, a shape broke the horizon. Not an iceberg, a ship. It was the Carpathia. It was small, only a single funnel, but it was steaming hard, black smoke pouring from its stack. It was the most beautiful thing Joan had ever seen. The men on the overturned boat began to stir. Hope is a powerful stimulant, but it is also dangerous. The realization that rescue was close made the bodies realize how cold they were. Men who had held on for hours suddenly slipped away, their reserves spent in the moment of salvation. Joan felt the change. He felt the stiffness in his legs. He looked at Maynard. "I'm going to swim for it," he said. He let go of the boat. He let go of Maynard's hand. He didn't wait for a lifeboat to come to him. He started swimming toward the Carpathia. It was madness. He had been in freezing water for nearly 3 hours. He should have been a corpse. But he was swimming. He covered nearly a quarter of a mile. He swam with the slow, plodding endurance of a machine that has forgotten how to stop. As he got closer, he saw a lifeboat. Collapsible B had been spotted by another boat, number 12, which was now collecting the survivors. Jochen changed course. He swam to boat 12. He reached up to the gunwale. "Here, take my hand," a voice called. He tried to pull himself up, but his body finally rebelled. The adrenaline vanished. The alcohol was gone. He was just a heavy, waterlogged mass of freezing flesh. He couldn't lift his leg over the side. He hung there, groaning. The people in the boat grabbed him. They pulled. He felt himself being dragged over the wood, wet and heavy as a sack of flour. He tumbled into the bottom of the boat, water pooling around him. He lay there, staring at the sky. He was alive. The sun broke the horizon fully now. It lit up the icebergs surrounding them. They were pink in the morning light, towering monsters of white and rose, beautiful and indifferent. They looked like temples. They looked like tombstones. Jochen closed his eyes. He shivered finally, a violent, racking convulsion that shook his entire frame. The heat of the bakery was 1,000,000 miles away. The whiskey was a memory, but the heart inside his chest was still beating, a slow, steady drum against the silence of the sea. He had outlived the unsinkable. He had outlived the panic. He had outlived the cold. As the lifeboat made its way toward the towering side of the Carpathia, Charles Jugan didn't look back at the empty patch of ocean where the Titanic had been. He looked at his hands. They were white, wrinkled and swollen, but they were the hands of a living man. He was hauled up the side of the rescue ship in a bosun's chair, a canvas sling. He swung in the air, suspended between the water and the deck, When his feet touched the solid wood of the Carpathia, he didn't collapse. He didn't ask for a doctor. He stumbled toward the galley. "I need a drink," he whispered, and in the chaotic, weeping crowd of survivors, nobody denied him. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and horror. He was the man who had walked into the water and walked back out. He was the anomaly. But the story wasn't over. The survival was just the prologue to the legacy. The doctors would come. The inquiries would come. The world would demand to know how a baker, fortified by whiskey, had cheated the laws of nature. And Jugin would have to tell them. He would have to explain the unexplainable. But for now, he simply sat in the warmth of the Carpathia, a blanket around his shoulders, watching the steam rise from a cup of coffee. He was safe. But he knew, with a certainty that would never leave him, that a part of him was still out there, treading water in the dark, waiting for a dawn that would never come for 1,500 others. The silence of the Carpathia was different from the silence of the ocean. The ocean's silence was vast and indifferent, a vacuum where life simply ceased to matter. The silence on the rescue ship was heavy with human presence. It was the silence of shock. It was the silence of 700 people realizing that they were the leftovers of a massacre. In the days that followed the rescue, the Carpathia steamed toward New York through a grey, weeping fog. The ship was a floating hospital, but also a floating morgue of memories. The dining salons were turned into dormitories. Women in fur coats slept on the floor next to steerage passengers wrapped in blankets. The rigid class structure of the Titanic had been dissolved by the water, replaced by a new, singular class, the survivors. Charles Joen moved through this ghost ship with a strange, vibrant energy. While others were catatonic, staring at the walls, unable to speak, Jochen was walking. He was eating. His feet were swollen, the skin tender and purple from the exposure, but he was upright. He became a source of fascination for the doctors on board. They checked his pulse. It was steady. They listened to his lungs, clear. They looked for the signs of frostbite that had claimed the fingers and toes of men who had spent only minutes in the water. Joen had spent hours in the freezing Atlantic, immersed, soaking, drifting, yet his tissue was intact. He didn't boast. He didn't hold court in the smoking room telling tall tales. He simply went back to being a baker. He found the Carpathia's galley. He helped with the bread. It was his way of grounding himself. The ovens of the Carpathia were smaller. The layout was different, but the heat was the same. The smell of yeast was the same. In the repetition of kneading dough, Jochen found a way to process the impossibility of his existence. When the ship arrived in New York on the rainy evening of April 18th, the world was waiting. The pier was a sea of black umbrellas and flashing magnesium bulbs. The press was hungry. They wanted heroes. They wanted villains. They wanted a narrative that would make sense of the senseless. They got the story of the band playing "Nearer My God to Thee." They got the story of Captain Smith going down with the bridge. They got the story of the unsinkable Molly Brown. These were stories that fit the romantic mold of the era. They were tragic, operatic, and noble. But then there was the story of the baker. It leaked out slowly. A man who had clung to the stern. A man who had stepped off the ship without getting his hair wet. A man who had paddled in the freezing dark for hours, buoyed by a bottle of alcohol. It didn't fit the mold. It was messy. It was confusing. To the temperance movements of the time, strong political forces in both America and England, Jochen's story was a problem. Alcohol was supposed to be a vice, a destroyer of families, a weakness. Here it appeared to be a savior. The inquiries began almost immediately, first in America, driven by a furious Senate, and then in London, driven by the British Board of Trade. These proceedings were intended to be autopsies of a disaster. They were held in high-ceilinged rooms with wood paneling and dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. Men in wigs and stiff collars sat at long tables, armed with diagrams and manifests. They wanted to measure the tragedy. They wanted to reduce the horror to columns of data: speed, tonnage, rivet spacing, lifeboat capacity. Into this dry, bureaucratic theatre walked Charles Joen. He was called to testify in London in May. The setting was the Scottish Drill Hall near Buckingham Palace. The acoustics were terrible. The air was stale. Lord Mersey, the wreck commissioner, presided over the affair with a stern, judicial boredom. When Jogin took the stand, he didn't look like a man who had stared into the abyss. He looked like a tradesman. He was polite, concise, and utterly unromantic. The Solicitor General, Sir John Simon, led the questioning. He was a man of precise language, trying to pin down a witness who had experienced chaos. "Now, Mr. Jogin," Simon asked, "you went up onto the boat deck." "Yes." "What did you do?" "I threw deck chairs overboard." The court was confused. "Deck chairs?" "Yes, to give the people in the water something to hold on to." It was a practical answer, but it painted a horrifying picture. A lone baker, surrounded by the screaming dying, throwing wooden furniture into the blackness in a desperate attempt to build a raft. The questioning turned to the alcohol. The lawyers danced around it. They didn't want to explicitly state that a crewman was drunk on duty, but they needed to understand his timeline. "Did you have provisions?" they asked. "I had a drop of liqueur," Jogin admitted. The court transcripts show he used the word liqueur, a polite euphemism for the hard whiskey he had consumed. And then I went to the stern. The testimony that followed is one of the most surreal documents in maritime history. Jogin described the final moments of the Titanic, not as a catastrophe, but as an elevator ride. "I was on the starboard side of the poop deck," he told the hushed room. "The ship took a lurch. I hung onto the rail. I was on the outside." "The outside of the ship?" "Yes, sir, on the side of the ship." "And what happened next?" "Well, she went down. I didn't go down. I just floated." He explained that as the stern sank, he simply transferred his weight from the railing to the water. "I didn't get my head under," he said. "I don't think I even got my hair wet." The lawyers exchanged glances. This was physically impossible. The suction alone should have dragged him down. The plunge of a 60,000-ton vessel creates a vortex. But Jogin insisted. He stepped off. He paddled away. "And how long were you in the water?" Lord Mersey asked. "I don't know, my lord," Jogin replied. 2 hours? 3? And you felt the cold?" "I felt it, yes. But I didn't feel it much." "Didn't feel it much." The phrase hung in the air. The water was 28 degrees. It was killing water. It had killed 1,500 people in that very same time frame. Men in fur coats had died. Stokers with muscles like iron had died. Children had died. But the baker didn't feel it much. The inquiry moved on. They had to discuss bulkheads and ice warnings. Jogin was dismissed. He stepped down from the stand, a footnote in the grand investigation. But in the medical journals and in the quiet conversations of the survivors, the debate was just beginning. How the whiskey defense became the popular theory. The public latched onto it. It was a dark joke, the drunk who survives the car crash because he goes limp, applied to the greatest maritime disaster in history. But the science is more complex and more haunting. When a human body enters freezing water, the cold shock is the first killer. It is a panic response. The heart rate spikes to 200 beats per minute. The blood pressure skyrockets. The victim gasps uncontrollably, inhaling water. Jogin, sedated by a significant amount of alcohol, likely bypassed this phase entirely. His central nervous system was depressed. The panic signals were blocked. He hit the water in a state of chemical calm. He didn't gasp. He didn't thrash. He simply began to swim. Then there is the second killer, cold incapacitation. This happens after 10 minutes. The body, desperate to save the core, constricts the blood vessels in the arms and legs. The muscles lose their supply of oxygen and sugar. They stop working. The victim can no longer swim. They lose the ability to keep their head above water, and they drown. Alcohol usually accelerates this by dilating the vessels, sending warm blood to the skin where the heat is lost to the water. Theoretically, Jogin should have died of hypothermia faster than anyone else. He was a radiator, pumping his body heat into the Atlantic. But Jogin had a unique physiology. He was a baker. He was well fed. He had a layer of subcutaneous fat that acted as insulation, a blubber layer, to use a crude term. And the alcohol, while losing heat, also provided a false sense of warmth that prevented the psychological surrender to the cold. Most people die in the water because they give up. The pain becomes too great. The hopelessness becomes too heavy. The mind shuts down the body. Jowton's mind was altered. He was floating in a dream state. The alcohol kept the terror at bay. He was paddling through a nightmare, but he was viewing it through a soft focus lens. He wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about daylight. He was thinking about the next stroke. It was a perfect accidental storm of survival factors. The right body type, the right position on the ship, the right amount of alcohol, and a mind that was naturally disciplined, orderly, and calm. But this explanation did not satisfy the public. They wanted a moral universe where virtue was rewarded. Jowton's survival felt like a cheat code. It felt like a glitch in the matrix. The inquiry released its report in the summer of 1912. It was a dense, technical document. It blamed excessive speed. It blamed the lack of lookouts. It blamed the regulations. It praised the heroism of the crew. Jowton was mentioned, but his miracle was buried in the transcripts. The narrative of the Titanic solidified around the tragedy of the Strauss couple refusing to separate, the bravery of the engineers keeping the lights on, the stoicism of the captain. Jowton went back to work. He didn't write a book. He didn't go on a speaking tour. He returned to the sea. It was the only life he knew. He signed on to other ships, other galleys. He baked bread on the Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship. He walked the same decks, looked out at the same ocean. But he was marked. He was the man who came back. In the years that followed, the story of the Titanic began to change. It shifted from a news event to a myth. It became a metaphor for the end of an era. The sinking was the end of Edwardian confidence, the precursor to the slaughter of the First World War. Jowton remained a strange artifact of that night. He was a living reminder that chaos does not follow rules. The iceberg didn't care about class. The water didn't care about bravery. And survival wasn't always about strength or heroism. Sometimes it was about a bottle of whiskey and a stubborn refusal to freeze. As the years passed, Jowton's hair turned grey, but he kept the secrets of that night locked away. He rarely spoke of it. When asked, he would shrug. "I was cold," he would say. "I was wet." He stripped the myth away, leaving only the bare, uncomfortable facts. But the world wouldn't let it go. Doctors continued to cite him in studies on hypothermia. Writers tried to interview him. They wanted to know what he saw when he was treading water in the silence. They wanted to know what the stars looked like when you are the last living thing in a graveyard. They wanted to know if he felt guilty. Survivor's guilt is a heavy coat to wear. Why me? Why not the child? Why not the mother? Jowton had thrown deck chairs to them. He had loaded them into boats. And yet, he was the one breathing the air. There is no record of Jowton breaking down. There is no record of him weeping in public. He carried the burden with the same workmanlike stoicism that he carried the sacks of flour. He did his job. He survived. That was the beginning and the end of it. But the echo of the Titanic followed him. It was there in the sound of ice clinking in a glass. It was there in the sudden drop of temperature on a winter evening. It was there in the smell of the ocean. He moved to New Jersey. He settled down. He found a quiet life, far from the spotlight of the inquiries. He baked. He married. He aged. But to history, he remained the anomaly, the glitch, the man who cheated the reaper with a flask in his pocket. The inquiry closed its books. The lawsuits were settled. The Titanic sat at the bottom of the Atlantic, slowly being consumed by rusticles, the iron-eating bacteria devouring the great hull. But the question remained, hovering over the story like the mist on the Grand Banks. What is the ingredient of survival? Is it preparation? Is it prayer? Or is it simply the blind, dumb luck of a man who drank a toast to his own death and found that death refused to drink with him?